So welcome, dear friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our very special guest today, Bill McKibben. You can find many other great upcoming Zoom sessions at www.beatitudecenter.org. First, a few little housekeeping things, then I'll say a prayer, and then I'll introduce Bill. Let me just remind everyone, please, to mute yourselves and to stay muted during the presentation, and to write any questions and comments in the chat link. You're very welcome to leave a question. I'm hoping Bill will speak for 45 minutes or an hour about whatever he wants to talk to us about, and then we'll open it up for questions, and we'll finish after an hour and a half. And I'll send out the Zoom recording link with Cassandra, my assistant, who's on the Zoom today in the next few days. So let's begin with a prayer. And so I invite everybody just to take a moment of silence and to enter into the presence of the God of peace, our Creator, who loves each one of you infinitely. And since this is the Beatitude Center for the Nonviolent Jesus, I invite us all to welcome the nonviolent Jesus
11:20, the same time.
into our hearts. Please mute yourselves, friends. Thank you. And ask for whatever graces you need as we begin our presentation.
Thank you.
Creator God, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us, most especially for Mother Earth and all the creatures and creation. Be with us now and bless us as we reflect with Bill. I know there's somebody talking, but I'll finish the prayer. Be with us as we reflect with Bill on how we can serve you in this time of catastrophic climate change to do our part to protect Mother Earth and the creatures and humanity. So I ask you, beloved God, Creator God, to inspire us, bless us, energize us, and send us forth that we might be your holy beatitude people who speak out and take positive nonviolent action against environmental destruction and all systemic injustice to promote peace here on earth for all creation. We ask this mighty blessing in Jesus' name, amen. And before I introduce Bill again, dear friends, let me just ask you please to mute yourselves if you haven't. Okay, so it's a great honor to introduce to you my friend Bill McKibben, who, Bill, you probably don't even remember, but I met you about 20 years ago. We were both speaking at an event in Washington, D.C. for our friend Rabbi Michael Lerner, and then we spoke at a rally in front of the White House together. And the last time I saw you, I was reflecting, was at Standing Rock in North Dakota. I consider Bill the world's leading environmentalist and activist and organizer and writer on climate change. And on behalf of everybody, I just want to thank you, Bill, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us on this Zoom. Bill's 1989 book, The End of Nature, was one of the first major books to address climate change and raise global awareness. I could talk for a half hour about Bill, and I just might, but I'll try to keep it to 2 minutes. Just for the basics, so everybody knows, he's the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. He's a contributing writer to The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, Sojourners, many others. He's the founder of the first global grassroots climate change campaign, www.350.org, and a founder recently of a new organization, thirdact.org, about mobilizing Americans over 60 to continue to work for fighting climate change. And I'm hoping Bill will talk about that with us today and anything else you want, Bill. In 2009, Bill and 350.org led the largest global protest against environmental destruction, with some 5,200 simultaneous demonstrations in 181 countries. And I was in New York, and the organizer for the Peace and Disarmament Wing, we had 425,000 people. It was a great day. He has been very involved in the Keystone XL pipeline campaign, Standing Rock and elsewhere. It was a key advisor to Jane Fonda's Fire Drill Fridays movement, which I've been a part of. He's written many best-selling books, and his latest, which I hope everyone will get, is called The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. What a title. Bill is the winner of many awards, including the Right Livelihood Award. Time magazine described him as the world's best green journalist. Boston Globe called him the nation's leading environmentalist. And recently he was featured again in the New York Times, talking about his new project, The Third Act. So, dear friends, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our leader, Bill McKibben, coming to us live from Vermont. Bill, you're very welcome here among friends, and the floor is yours, and I'm going to mute myself and teach us and tell us whatever you need to. Thank you for joining us, Bill.
Well, Father John, everybody else, what a pleasure to get to be with you, and greetings from the rainy mountains of the Northeast. I really is a great honor to get to join this company for a little while because of all the things that y'all have done for so long and so well. And I'll get back to that. I thought what I might do is talk for a few minutes about where we actually stand in this climate fight, and then how we're going to nonviolently do what we can to see how much progress we can make. Let me say as I start that it's not mostly a very pretty story, and so I apologize in advance because it's all, some of it anyway, scary stuff. I think someone may be still unmuted someplace.
I'll work on that, Bill.
All right, not a worry for me.
I'm slow at it, but I will be working on that during this. So keep going.
I did write the first book about climate change back in 1989 when I was in my 20s. And the great tragedy of this story is that we basically knew everything then that we know now about climate change. It's not like there's been some huge scientific insight. We understood it then. When you burn coal and gas and oil, you put carbon into the atmosphere, and the molecular structure of that carbon dioxide traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. The scientists warned us quite clearly and quite robustly that if we didn't stop burning fossil fuels, the planet would begin to dramatically heat, and it would do it quickly. We did not take the action that scientists recommended, and so what do you know? Their warnings are coming true, and coming true in very dramatic fashion. So far, humans have raised the temperature of the planet about 1 degree Celsius, a little more. That doesn't sound like so much. That's about 2 degrees Fahrenheit for those of us who live in metrically challenged North America. If it's 65 right now on the porch where I'm sitting, and if it's 67 when I'm done talking, my body won't really notice the difference. But the planet notices the difference because that's so much heat over such a huge area. In fact, it's easier to think about this if we use other units. The average amount of heat trapped every day near our planet because of the carbon we've poured into the atmosphere, it's the heat equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs every day. So when you think about it in those units, it gets easier to understand how it is that we've melted most of the sea ice in the summer Arctic, that we have begun to dramatically raise the level of the oceans, that we have, most dramatically discombobulated the way that water moves around this planet, the hydrological cycle. If you wanted one statistic, one fact to help you understand the 21st century, you could do worse than warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That means that in arid areas, think California, you get more heat, hence more evaporation, and then drought, and then eventually things catch fire. That's why we're seeing absolutely epic wildfires around the world now on a scale we've never seen before. Those of us in the Northeast 2 weeks ago spent days breathing the smoke from the incredible wildfires in Canada, by far their biggest forest fires ever. Truthfully, I'm kind of glad that that smoke drifted down the power corridor between New York and Washington, because for a few days, people in those important places got to feel what most human beings live with much of the year now. So once that water has evaporated up into the atmosphere, it's going to come down. And that's why we see flood and deluge on a scale that we've never seen before. Maybe you saw the pictures about 6 weeks ago from Fort Lauderdale, where they got 25 inches of rain in 6 hours. There's no way to build a sewer system large enough to cope with anything like that. So there were lots of pictures of SUVs bobbing down the main street of Fort Lauderdale. But Fort Lauderdale's rich enough that it can handle that kind of thing for a little while. That's not true of most of the world. Last August, it started raining in Pakistan, and it didn't stop across huge areas of that country for the next 3 weeks. It's probably the greatest rainstorm since Noah, and it was just incomprehensible in its effect. There were large parts of Sindh and Balochistan provinces that got 800% of their annual rainfall in 3 weeks. That is, in 3 weeks, they got more rain than they normally get in 8 years. People in that part of the world often have mud brick homes. It's a very good architectural style for that part of the world. Its only drawback is if it rains like that, eventually your house just melts around you. 33 million people were displaced in that Pakistani flood. That's as if everybody from Baltimore to Boston were out of their house. And here's the kicker, and the thing that really brings home the climate story in the most profound ways. The 200 million people in Pakistan are responsible for way less than 1% of the CO2 that's up in the atmosphere. The 3% of the world's population that calls itself Americans are responsible for about 25% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. If there's 33 million people displaced in Pakistan, a kind of elementary moral math tells us that 8 million of them are on us, you know? We're nearer the beginning of this saga, sadly, than the end. We've raised the temperature 2 degrees Fahrenheit so far, but we're on track to raise it 5 or 6 degrees Fahrenheit on sort of current trajectories. If we allow that to happen, then we will not have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. That's too much violent flux and chaos. The UN estimates, for instance, that would be enough to produce somewhere between 1 and 3 billion climate refugees this century. Some extraordinary percentage of humanity out of their homes and looking for a new place to live on a crowded planet where there isn't an easy place for everybody to move to. We've seen what 1 million or 2 refugees have done to completely wreck the political equilibrium of Western Europe and North America. Now multiply that by 1,000. We're going to need extraordinary reservoirs of grace and goodwill and generosity and brotherhood to even begin to cope with any tiny fraction of that number. Our main job has to be to figure out how to hold that increase in temperature as low as possible. We're not going to stop global warming. That's no longer on the menu. we may still be able to stop it short of the place where it cuts civilization off at the knees. That's the biggest challenge that humans have ever faced, and it's particularly big because it has to be done fast in order to matter. We're used to political problems that are intractable, that we spend our whole lifetimes dealing with, that we make some progress on, and then we go back and forth and we push forward and whatever. Climate change is not like that. The ultimate adversary here isn't other groups of people that have to be persuaded or overcome. The ultimate adversary here is physics, and physics is immature. It doesn't compromise. It doesn't meet you halfway. It just does what it's going to do. And our scientists have explained to us what it's going to do. We need to cut emissions, they've told us, in half by 2030 in order to have a chance of meeting the targets we set in Paris just 8 years ago. 2030 is not very far away. By my watch, it's 6 years and 5 months away. That's an extraordinary challenge. And we need to meet challenges like that in order just to be able to keep going on working on this. At some point, if we don't, then all of this will become moot. Winning slowly on climate change is simply a different way of losing. Dr. King, my great American hero, used to end his talks by quoting from the Massachusetts abolitionist Theodore Parker. He would say, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice," which I think basically translates to, "This may take a while, but we're going to win." That was a comforting thought, but it's not a comfort that in this case we get to share. The arc of the physical universe is short and it bends towards heat. If we don't win, we don't soon, then we don't win. So that is the bad news, the hard news. We've walked through the valley for a moment, so now I will take a breath, you take a breath, and we'll deal with somewhat better news, which is that we more or less know what we need to do to deal with this situation. Since climate change is caused mostly by burning fossil fuel, we have to stop. And since we use lots of power, we can try to use somewhat less power, and we have to find other ways to generate that power. The first task is conservation and efficiency, and it's one we all can put our minds to, and I bet everybody here has. The second task is the rapid build out of renewable energy sources. We have a great gift from the engineers and scientists who over the last decade have lowered the price of renewable energy by about 90%. Sometime 3 or 4 years ago, we crossed some invisible line where that price for making power from the sun and the wind became cheaper than from burning coal and gas and oil. We now live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That is a huge, huge change. It allows human beings to imagine for the first time in 700,000 years that they could stop burning things. Fire has defined our species. Darwin said fire and language were the two things that really defined human beings. And for the most part, fire served us pretty well. We learned to cook food, and that accounts for our large brains. We were able to move north and south away from the equator. The anthropologists think that the social bonds that mark our species were developed over long eons of standing around the campfire every night. Once we learned to control the combustion of coal and gas and oil in the Industrial Revolution, that produced modernity. But the cost for that burning has gotten much, much, much higher. There is the cost that I've described the absolutely existential climate crisis that we face. That's the biggest thing human beings have ever done, and by far, by orders of magnitude. We're triggering the sixth great mass extinction on this planet. We're essentially at this point running Genesis in reverse, engaging in a kind of decreation on this earth. But it's not the only cost that comes with burning. Burning stuff invariably produces small particles in the air that then get into human lungs. We think now, from good news studies in the last year or two, that 9 million people on this planet each year, that is 1 death in 5, die from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. If you have been to Delhi or Shanghai or something in recent years, you won't find this impossible to believe. But that happens here too. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood asthma diagnosed every year in America, many of them from breathing bad air, and we know who gets to breathe that bad air. We know who gets to live next to refineries and highways and so on and so forth. And the third cost, of course, we've really seen dramatically this past year. If you rely on resources that are only available in a few places, then the people who control those few places will have too much power and they'll be likely to abuse it. In the United States, our biggest oil and gas barons by far were the Koch brothers. They controlled more refining and pipeline capacity than anyone else. And they used their vast winnings to degrade and deform our democracy. In Europe, the biggest oil and gas baron is Vladimir Putin. And he used his winnings to launch something we'd hoped we would not ever see, a land war in Europe in the 21st century. Just carnage and sadness on a huge, huge scale. So it's very nice to imagine not far off a world where we could instead be relying on energy sources that are available to everyone, everywhere. The sun shines and the wind blows on all parts of creation. I'm a sometime Methodist Sunday school teacher. That's as high as I've ever risen in the ecclesial hierarchy, so don't expect in-depth theology from me. But I do like the idea that we could be substituting energy from heaven for energy from hell. And the sooner we do it, the better. That doesn't mean that it's a free lunch. If you got to build batteries and solar panels and things, then you need lithium and cobalt and some other things to mine. And we can do that badly, as we're doing it now often, or we can do it better, and we should be working to do it better. Part of which means using as little of it as possible. It's a good thing that we're getting electric cars, but they do not need to be electric Hummers. It would be really nice if they were electric buses for our public transit systems and e-bikes for moving people around cities. But do not make the mistake of thinking that the scale of the damage from that mining, say, is comparable to the scale of the damage we see from what we're doing right now every day. Remember, 9 million people a year are dying from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. And the way to think about this transition is, if you go mine lithium or cobalt for a battery or a solar panel, you do it once, and then it sits there for the next 25 years, and every time the sun rises above the horizon, it delivers your energy. If you mine coal for your energy, what do you do with it? You set it on fire, and it means that the next day you have to go mine some more of it. A good way to kind of keep this in your mind is to remember that 40% of all the ship traffic on planet Earth is merely carrying coal and gas and oil back and forth around the planet to be burnt. So there's a possibility for a remarkable dematerialization of the Earth in many ways. However, understanding that distinction between energy that you burn every day and allowing the burning to take place on the sun helps you understand why we're not moving as rapidly as we need to make this change. That's because there's an extraordinarily powerful group of people on our planet who do not want us to make that change and who are trying to slow it down. They are the people, the fossil fuel industry, who have thrived for a century by making you pay every day for your new installment of energy. And for them, the idea that the sun would deliver it for free is the stupidest business model of all time. So they have deployed all their political power to make sure that it doesn't happen. That's been the story of the last 30 years, as we now know, thanks to great investigative reporting. What reporters from places like the LA Times and the Columbia Journalism School have just uncovered and proved is that back when I was writing that book in the 1980s, and back when Jim Hansen at NASA was developing the big computer models that let us understand what was going on, the fossil fuel industry was also hard at work here, which makes sense. I mean, Exxon was then the biggest company on Earth. It had a huge staff of scientists, and its product was carbon. Of course, they were going to find out what was going on. They outfitted their tankers with monitors to track CO2 around the world. And their scientists, by the mid-1980s, were telling their executives in great detail what was going to happen. Whistleblowers have come forward, and archivists have uncovered documents showing their scientists telling their executives precisely what the temperature was going to be in 2020. They were spot on almost uncanny level of accuracy. They understood what was happening, and the executives believed those scientists. Exxon started building its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. The only thing they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Instead, they invested across this industry billions of dollars in building this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that kept us locked for 30 years in a completely sterile debate about whether or not global warming was real. A debate, remember, that both sides knew the answer to at the start. It's just one of them was willing to lie. And that lie turns out perhaps to be the most consequential lie in human history, because it cost us the one thing we desperately needed, which was time. That's why we have 6 years now to try and cut emissions in half instead of 40 years. And it's not as if this campaign of deceit has ended. You can no longer get away, unless maybe you're Donald Trump, with just absolute all-out climate denial. There have been too many forest fires and floods. So they've switched their tactic to delay, to slowing down this transition, to making it take as long as possible, to coming up with every kind of jury-rigged and gimcrack solution they can to keep trying to burn something somewhere, because that's what their fortune depends on. They have tens of trillions of dollars in coal and gas and oil still beneath the ground that they own, and they are determined to monetize, even at the cost of breaking the planet, which is now clearly the cost. So we've got an extraordinary problem, the biggest problem that humans have ever faced. We've got a powerful set of solutions. We have a huge opposition to implementing those solutions in a timely fashion. That's where we get to the, for me, most interesting part of this puzzle, which is how we manage to make that solution happen anyway, even over the extraordinary power of the fossil fuel industry. And here, maybe I'll back up and just tell a personal story for a minute to kind of demonstrate my cluelessness in these matters. You know, it took me way too long to figure out that we were going to need to put up a spirited, nonviolent fight here. I'm a writer and an academic, and writers and academics are both, I think, deeply devoted to the notion that the important thing is to win the argument. So, having written that first book about climate change, I merrily proceeded to write some more and to organize lots of symposiums and lots of journal articles and on and on and on. And it took me 10 years of doing this, of trying to win the argument in the faith that once we'd done that, our leaders would take action, because why wouldn't they? Before I began to wise up to things that most of you probably figured out a very long time ago. It became clear that the argument was over. The science was completely clear about climate change, and the consensus among scientists very profound. We'd won the argument. We were just losing the fight, because the fight wasn't about data and reason and evidence. The fight was about what fights are always about, money and power. And the fossil fuel industry had so much money and so much power, therefore, that it meant they could lose the argument, but it didn't make any difference. They were merrily proceeding with their business model. And it began to dawn on me that we were going to have to assemble some power ourselves. It obviously wasn't going to come from having billions of dollars, so it was going to have to come from the only other place power comes from, the currency of movements, passion, spirit, creativity, the willingness sometimes to spend your body and go to jail. And so that's what we set out to do. Now, I had no idea how to do any of this. I think most people engaging in nonviolent, I think it's getting a little better now as we have sort of more training and writing and thinking, but mostly people just make it up as they go along. I certainly know that's what I was doing. In 2006, I'd come back from a really painful, epic trip to Bangladesh, one of the places suffering most. And I just was fed up and wanted to do something. And I called up a bunch of my writer friends in Vermont and said, well, we've got to do something. Let's go up to the federal office in Burlington, which is our main city. It's only 50,000 people, so it's not much of a city, but it's what we've got. You know? I said, well, we'll do a sit-in on the steps of the federal building, and we'll get arrested, and at least there'll be a story in the paper, and we will have done something. And all these other writers, clueless as I, oh, it's a good idea, let's try it. Happily, one of them was smart enough to call up to the police in Burlington in advance and say, what'll happen if we do this intrepid stunt? And the police said, nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you want, you know? So we decided we better recalibrate. And instead, we went on a march. We left from Robert Frost's old cabin in the Green Mountains, because Robert Frost is kind of our patron saint in Vermont. And we marched up the west side for 5 days. We slept in farm fields at night. I called the Methodist churches so that, you know, the Methodist sacrament pretty much is the potluck supper. So we made sure we had those along the way. And by the time we got to Burlington, there were 1,000 people marching, which to all of you sounds like nothing. But in Vermont, 1,000 people is a lot of people. I mean, except for University of Vermont hockey games, that's about as big a crowd as you get. In fact, we got to the edge of Burlington, and our then congressman, not yet a senator, Bernie Sanders, was there to greet us at the city limits. And he was very happy because he likes organizing. And he was, this is great. This is great. I haven't seen this many people since the Vietnam War. This is fantastic. Such good work you're doing. What is this about again? And we told him what it was about again. And he's gone on to be the great climate champion in the whole Senate. Bernie has just been remarkable on this. But here's the bad part. There was a story the next day in the newspaper that said that 1,000 people that we had gathered in Burlington was the largest demonstration about climate change that had yet taken place in the US. This was 2006. We read that. I thought, well, no wonder we're losing. We've got all the things you'd need for a movement. We've got Al Gore, we've got scientists, we've got policy people. we've just forgot the movement part. There's no people there to give it any weight or any power. So that's what we started trying to organize. And when I say we, I mean, in this case, myself and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury College, where I hang out in rural Vermont. And we had no idea what we were doing and no money, but we knew we needed to organize globally because this is the first truly global crisis we've ever come up against. That's why we picked this slightly odd name, 350.org, that because Jim Hansen, my old friend at NASA, I asked him, what's the number? We need a number because we're not going to use English words to organize the globe, but Arabic numerals might work. What's the safe number on this planet? Jim said, I've been wondering about that too. Let me put my team to work. And 3 or 4 months later, he called up and said, we've got a number. In fact, we're delivering a paper at the American Geophysical Union tomorrow. So we've got a number, but it's not one you're going to like, 350 parts per million. And I winced when he said it because I knew enough climate science to know we were already past that. 350 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere is the safe upper bound for CO2 in the atmosphere. We're at 420 parts per million now. That's why California catches on fire and the Arctic melts, But at any rate, we had a number to work with and we went to work. And as I say, there were 7 undergraduates. There are 7 continents, so each one took one. The guy who got the Antarctic also had to take the internet, And off we went to do our work, which was to find other people like ourselves. In those days, there weren't exactly environmentalists every place on the planet, but every place on the planet, there was someone who cared about public health, development, women's rights, war and peace, all the other things that we were not going to be able to have on a rapidly degrading Earth, and they became our allies. And so when we called for this first global day of action in 2009, people really responded. Father John described it a little bit earlier, but I'll tell you a little more detail. We'd asked people to do something somewhere, wherever they were, on this one Saturday in October. And we were sitting around our tiny 1-room office the Thursday before doing the last minute work of press releases and things. When the phone rang, it was the satellite phone, and it was our leader in Ethiopia, who like many of us most of us was a she, and like many of us was 17. And she was in tears. And she said, the government took away our permit for Saturday. It's Ethiopia, not always a very nice government. So we're doing this today before they can stop us, which was brave. But that's not why she was crying. She kept saying, we wanted to do this the same day as everybody else. We wanted to be part of this whole big thing around the world with everybody else. We hope we're not spoiling it. We're really sorry. And we have 10,000 kids right now out in the street in Addis Ababa chanting 350. I was like, wow, do not worry about the date. You've done great. But we need a picture of that, and we need it right away so we can send it out around the world to get reporters interested. And she said, well, that's going to be a problem because the internet's down today in Addis, I was like, I looked, and thus began a short saga that illustrated an awful lot for me. I looked on the internet and discovered that there was one Western hotel in Addis, the Intercontinental. And I knew they would have good internet in the lobby. So I said, go to the Intercontinental and send us the picture from there. And about 20 minutes later, get another phone call. And remember, this 17-year-old girl, and she said, you know what? They won't let me into the lobby of the Intercontinental. It's not really for Black people. And I was like, oh my God. We're getting more of an education than I want right now, but we needed the picture. And I said, well, look around. Apparently most of the traffic there was people who were coming from America to adopt Ethiopian children. I said, find some nice looking white lady and hand her your phone and tell her to go in there and press the button. And that's eventually what happened. And within a few minutes, we had a picture that we were able to get around the globe and that really managed to helped galvanize things, but it was a deep lesson in power right from the start in our work. It was a good luck omen too. Before the next 48 hours were out, we'd had 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political activity on the planet. My job that day was pretty much just monitoring the incoming photos and getting them up. We'd rented out the big billboards, electronic billboards at the end of Times Square that are usually whiskey ads and things. And instead we were just putting these pictures up as they came in, and they were coming in 10 and 20 a second from around a minute from around the world at parts. But as I was monitoring them, it didn't take me long to have a deep revelation. I'd always heard that environmentalism was something that rich white people did. And if you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist, and on and on and on. After half an hour, it was extremely clear to me that almost everyone we were working with was poor, black, brown, Asian, young, because really almost everybody on Earth falls into those categories. And what do you know? They were exactly as worried about the future as anybody else, maybe more, because the future bears down harder on you. As I have said, climate change is the most unfair thing that people have ever figured out how to do. At any rate, it was a powerful day. And we continued to do this kind of almost what you'd call educational organizing. Over the next few years, we had a couple more of these big days of action. We think we've organized about 20,000 demonstrations around the world in every country except North Korea. And we probably would have kept up that work if this was not a time-limited phenomenon, but it is. We don't have time for education alone to do what we need. So we moved more to confrontation. The first big thing that we helped really organize and get off the ground was the national fight against the Keystone Pipeline, which became really the signal environmental battle of the last decade. And it really began because we organized what turned into the largest civil disobedience action about anything in this country in many years in August of 2011, with 2 weeks of arrests at the Capitol. We sent 1,254 people to jail, I think, and it was enough to get that campaign sort of up and running. And big oil, this turned out to be the first big defeat of this kind that they've suffered. Pretty much simultaneously with my friend Naomi Klein, we launched this campaign for fossil fuel divestment around the globe, drawing on the experience that some of you were probably engaged in of the divestment campaign around apartheid in South Africa. Indeed, the first person we called to ask if it was all right to do this was Archbishop Tutu, and he said, who won the Nobel Prize for his work leading that first divestment campaign. And he said, please take this tactic. Apartheid was the human rights issue a generation ago, but climate change is clearly the human rights issue of our moment. So we did, and it's been successful beyond our imaginings. We're at now $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have cut their ties to the fossil fuel industry. By that measure, it's the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history, and it continues. We had tremendous news yesterday when the Church of England, after 11 years of work, announced that they were divesting from fossil fuel. And such thanks to groups like Operation Noah in the UK that really kept up this pressure. And for those of you in the American West, the California legislature is debating divesting its vast pension funds this week. So if you happen to be in California, send a note to your assembly person that Senate Bill 252 is a crucial thing to pass. But the biggest effect of those divestment campaigns may have been the crop of activists that they raised. Our thinking was, when we began, that most people don't have a pipeline or an oil well near them, but everybody's close to a pot of money, a church fund, a university endowment, a pension fund. So we could have this battle going on in 10,000 places simultaneously. And that's what happened. Pretty much every important university in the world has had a big campaign about this, and most of them have been successful by this point. Harvard and Princeton and Oxford and Cambridge and the University of California and the University of Michigan, you name it, have divested from fossil fuel. When the kids who organized those campaigns got out of school, they wanted to keep working, so they formed what's called the Sunrise Movement. And it's the Sunrise Movement that brought us the Green New Deal proposal. And that Green New Deal proposal is what finally got us the Inflation Reduction Act, this climate bill that's the first time that Congress has actually acted on climate change. So of all the things that make me happy about that divestment work, that's top among them. And those young people, of course, are not the only young people doing their job well. By now, you've all familiar with the great work that Greta Thunberg and other high school and junior high school students around the world have been doing. Greta is one of my favorite people on the planet. I love working with her. She is as great from up close as she is from a distance. I think that she stands with, her school strike stands with Gandhi making salt, or Rosa Parks refusing to get up from the bus, as one of the great gestures in nonviolent movement history, a master of the politics of gesture. Greta would be the first to tell you that there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs around the planet, and I've gotten to know thousands of them on every continent, young people who are leading this work, and they have 10 million followers. That's how many people were out on school strike in September of 2019 before the pandemic hit. It's one of the biggest nonviolent actions of all time. So the kids are doing their job as you would expect, because it's their lives that'll be shadowed for their entire lives by this crisis. However, I have heard one too many people explain to me that it's up to the next generation to solve this problem, which A, strikes me as ignoble. They didn't cause it. And B, strikes me as highly impractical. Given that we have to work very, very fast, we do not have time for these kids to grow up and become CEOs and senators. We need to get this work done now. Remember, next 6 years is crucial. So, by themselves, young people lack the structural power to make change on the scale we need in the time that we have. When I thought about it and looked around the world to sort of wonder who did have structural power, one of the groups that I settled on was people like me, those of us over a certain age. There's 70 million Americans over the age of 60. It's possible that one or two of the other people on this phone call today are in that group. 70 million is a big number. That's bigger than the population of France. There are 10,000 more every single day. That's more people than are born in the US every day. Not only are there a lot of us, we have lots of political power. Why? Because we all vote. There is no known way to stop old people from voting. Okay? Not only that, we ended up with most of the money. Not everybody's affluent or even comfortable, but taken as a whole, the baby boomers and the silent generation above them have 70% of the country's financial assets. So if you wanted to take on Washington or your state capital or Wall Street, it would be useful to have some people with hairlines like mine. That's why we started organizing about 18 months ago this thing called Third Act, progressive organizing around climate and democracy for people over the age of 60. And it has taken off like a rocket. We've got tens of thousands of volunteers hard at work, chapters forming in every state, people doing remarkable things. This will not come as a surprise to the people on this call, because you all have been involved in this work your whole lives. But the political scientists were discouraging about this kind of effort on the theory that people become more conservative as they age. That may be true in some abstract sense, more to protect or something. But in the case of this generation, I think it's not true. Because if you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, it means your first act was during that period of epic social and cultural and political transformation, when we began to take women seriously as political actors, the apex of the civil rights movement, the first Earth Day in 1970, when 20 million Americans, 10% of the population, were in the streets. If you have any doubt about all of that, look at the things that the Supreme Court went after in their right-wing rampage last summer. Civil Rights Act of 1965, Gun Control Act of 1968, Clean Air Act of 1970, Roe v. Wade 1973. Having won some of these battles once, we can help win them again. And so it has been extraordinarily good fun to get to work with young people on sort of intergenerationally on these fights. One observation I'll make after 18 months of doing this is that the age gap that separates people the age of grandparents and grandchildren is much easier to work across than the age gap that separates people the age of parents and children. It's not a fraught relationship, grandparents and grandkids. All grandparents love their grandkids unconditionally at all times. All grandchildren are wise enough to cut their grandparents some slack. So it's been lots of fun. One of our big efforts around climate has been to take on the big banks, Citi, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are the biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry. We started because the American chapter of Fridays for the Future, Greta's group, told us they wanted to take on these banks, but most of them were too young to even have bank accounts or credit cards. So could we help? I said, sure. And the first big demonstration we did was in Boston, I think. And I remember being there. There were hundreds of high school kids, and because they're somewhat sprier, they were at the front of the march. But at the back of the march, there was a big crowd of us older people with a big banner that said, "Fossils against fossil fuels." It was good fun for the young people that were there to see themselves getting some backup. We just finished this big day of action in March where we organized 100 simultaneous demonstrations outside those banks across North America, shutting them down, many of them for the day. I was in Washington, D.C., our big protest there where there were thousands of people, and where we shut down those 4 bank branches. We've reached the age where sit-ins, if they mean sprawling across the sidewalk for hours at a time, are not as attractive a proposition as they used to be. So instead, our third act crew across Virginia and DC and Maryland went to the Salvation Army stores and found dozens and dozens of old rocking chairs, which they repainted, and we shut down the banks with the sit-in and rocking chairs. It was beautiful. And next day, the New York Times had a big story about the rocking chair rebellion that was underway, and so on and so forth. We're going to do a lot more of this, and we hope you guys can figure out some ways to join in. Let me just close by saying such thanks for the work that the Beatitude Center has been doing around nonviolence in general. I think, and I've written, that it'll turn out that the 2 most important inventions of the 20th century were the solar panel and the nonviolent social movement. That these are 2 extraordinary pieces of technology. The solar panel, invented to go on spaceships originally, but now capable of powering a civilization. The nonviolent social movement, invented at the fringes by people outside the normal channels of power. Gandhi, Dr. King, the suffragettes, a million others whose names we don't know. A technology that somehow allows the small and the many to stand up to the mighty and the few. I think that older people have a particular role to play in that nonviolent work. I was telling you before about those protests at the Capitol in 2011 that started the Keystone Pipeline fight. I wrote the letter asking people to come take part, come get arrested. Never an easy letter to write, but as I say, it must have been somewhat well written because 1,200 and some people showed up. One of the things I said was, I did not think young people should have to be the cannon fodder here. They've done most of the leading, but if you're 19, perhaps an arrest record in our economy is not the best thing for your resume. One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you? You know? So we did not ask people as they showed up, how old are you? That would have been rude. But we did cleverly, I think, say to them, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administrations. On the last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He was so old, he'd been born during the Warren Harding administration, which was long enough ago, I'd basically forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration. It was so good for the young people who were there to see their elders acting the way we need elders acting, not necessarily getting arrested. That's one small part, though the dramatic one, of movement building, but just to see people way outside their comfort zones. If there's one message I want to leave you guys with, and one I don't know you don't need because you're already there, but we need to be outside our comfort zone because our planet is way, way outside its comfort zone. That's what it means when all of a sudden both poles are melting and the oceans are rising. We have to be outside our comfort zones to have some hope of catching up with that. So that's why we do what we do. I've rattled on too long. Many thanks for bearing with it. If there are questions or comments or critique or abuse or whatever else, I'm happy to entertain it for a little while, but I also don't want to take up your entire afternoon either.
Bill, thank you so very much. I mean, it's life-changing to listen to you, Bill, and I'm just very moved. It's a spiritual experience and a wake-up call and one of the greatest messages I've ever heard in my life. I have about 20 questions for you. I'm going to ask you one, and then I'll call on Ruth Ann, and then I'll call on my friend Mark, and then we'll open it up with some others. I see about 10 other questions for you, Bill. But again, a big, big thank you. And we'll go for about a half hour or so if you can stand it.
Absolutely.
So we just to cut to the chase about movements. I just want to ask you to talk a little bit about next steps in the movement. And so however you want to take that. My thought is that as to paraphrase what you said, the only way positive change happens is from bottom up people power grassroots movements. Okay, you and I are students of Gandhi and Dr. King, and what you've done has been incredible, but we're needing and looking towards building the greatest global grassroots bottom up nonviolent movement of social change in history. And you've done this, you've done it, but it needs to continue like never before, and using Gandhi and nonviolence. And I've been moved by Fire Drill Fridays and Jane Fonda's work, as well as Sunrise and Extinction Rebellion. But I was following her great Zooms and having been arrested with her, and she talked about, now we're coming to 2024. This is where are we going with movement building? She says, kind of as you're saying, it's just political will that we need now. We need to just kind of shut down the world in civil disobedience or however we can. And she's starting a political pact with the elections next year and so forth and so on. So I wondered if you could, and so I hope everyone heard Bill's call to join thirdact.org, and they have a great website. Also check out 350.org. But Bill, any specific thoughts on next steps in terms of Gandhian, Kingian, grassroots movement building? I think we all have to become not just activists, but organizers.
Well, exactly right. There's two organizational tasks going on here. One continues to be standing up to the power of the fossil fuel industry. That's very hard. We've got pipelines to fight, divestment campaigns to win, on and on and on. The other organizational task now is to figure out how to get deployed in our communities around the world these new technologies. We need to change out 1 billion machines in America alone. Furnaces, gas stoves, internal combustion engine cars, and we have to do it fast. And that's an organizing challenge, and people are beginning to approach it that way. Beginning organizing city by city and neighborhood by neighborhood to make that transition easier, cheaper, faster. So there's great work going on, and some of it's, at places that are sort of new to this, like groups like Rewiring America and things. And we're doing that on a global basis too. At Third Act last year, our response to Putin's hideous invasion of Ukraine, and the ongoing war crimes every day as he bombs civilian apartment blocks and things, was to launch a program we called Heat Pumps for Peace and Freedom. And we managed to free up $250 million out under the Defense Production Act through the Biden administration to be used not for weapons, but for heat pumps, to help reduce the demand for energy and hence help reduce Putin's ability to dominate others. And so we were really proud of that. Those kind of work on both fronts is going to go on. I don't know that much about, I still don't know that much about movements and how they work, and I'm still sort of making it up as we go along. The main thing I know is they work better the bigger they are. The more people you assemble, the more power you then have. And so we need to keep growing them and growing them and growing them. I do wish we had a better sense of how everything worked, and I do think, and I'm grateful for those sort of students of nonviolence that help us understand it. Erica Chenoweth at Harvard, your work at the Beatitude Center, Michael Nagler, on and on and on, the people who are doing this work. My particular hero of all from the 20th century was a man named Ghaffar Abdul Khan, Gandhi's favorite associate in what we now would call the Pathan country of what's now in Afghanistan, but then was in what the British called the Northwest Frontier Province. And when I get depressed, I need inspiration, I read reread a book called A Man to Match His Mountains about Ghaffar Abdul Khan. And it reminds me that we can do this. And in fact, we don't have to be nearly as brave as many of the people who came before us. But that's the work we're doing, is just to keep enlarging things. And I'm very hopeful that bringing lots and lots of older people into this work will be helpful. Older people have a couple of great attributes. One of them is that they have a lot of time, which they may not have had at earlier points in their life, and a lot of skills and a lot of resources and connections. And the other is that once you get them in this fight, they're at it for a long time. The only problem with college students is they graduate, But if you turn 60, well, you're going to be an older person for the next quarter century anyway, So once we get people engaged in this fight, I think we can really count on building this force out over time.
Great. Bill, tell people what they can actually do at thirdact.org.
Sure.
What you can register or donate.
And sign up at thirdact.org. And we've really got a bunch of different campaigns going. Once you sign up, we'll contact you to help set you up with your local, the local state chapter. Also, people are organizing chapters by what they did in the course of their professional lives. So there are third act educators, third act healthcare workers, lawyers, so on and so forth, bringing their particular skills to bear, third act creatives. So we've been doing a lot of work on the financing around fossil fuels, and we'll keep up this work on banks and so on. We're training people up to spend a lot of time taking on the public utility commissions state by state that will determine how fast we roll out renewable energy. These are usually captured by the local utility, so it's really important to train people to understand their Byzantine ways. And then, as with Jane's great work, we know that electoral politics is important too. We're heading into a crucial election year. One of the projects we've been running, John, is a thing we call Senior to Senior, where older people are writing high school seniors and in telling them, encouraging them to register to vote by telling them why voting has mattered in their lifetimes.
Wow.
These are great fun for the people who are writing them. I was at an assisted living, I was at a retirement community giving a talk a couple of weeks ago.
Wow.
When I'm done, they took me up to the assisted living part to introduce me to a 97-year-old woman who couldn't get out of bed, but she was writing 10 and 15 letters like this a day because she wanted to continue to have some, some outlet for her hopes about the world.
That's amazing.
The letters are also fun for people to receive, because it turns out that if you're 17, there's a pretty good chance that you've never actually gotten a letter from someone that they've just written you in your whole life. You've gotten lots of emails and Snapchats and Instagrams, but that penmanship that you spent 3 or 4 years learning long ago turns out to be kind of a secret weapon in our digital age.
That's great, Bill. Great. Ruth Ann, a quick question.
Oh boy, I don't think it's going to be that quick.
We'll try to be quick. We only have 15 minutes.
I'll try. Bill, I'm from Morro Bay, California, and my nonprofit works under the People of Faith for Justice out of San Luis Obispo. And we have something called the Center for the Ecological Civilization that we're working on. And Morro Bay is facing a big decision right now. Most of our work is done in community, and we do a lot of nonviolent work in the community. The decisions we have to make are we going to have a wind farm 44 miles off our coast? And do we want battery storage in our defunct power plant right now? And there's a lot of dissension coming up. And what we need to have fuel for is how to really help people understand why we need this, etc. However, you touched on this in your talk. We also came to know that in order to make solar panels and wind farms, it takes a lot of minerals, right? And a lot of metals. And we saw a newsletter that came out of Canada that was saying that we are in the process of raping the earth by trying to get these minerals out of the earth, also using slave labor in some countries, etc. And I started to reread Small is Beautiful. I had to read that when I was with Governor Brown's office back in the late 70s. And it really is interesting how at that time you're looking at getting rid of coal, going to fossil fuel, oil and gas, and then thinking that they're going to depend on nuclear as the energy thing. And we all know how well that hasn't worked out. Aren't we not doing the same thing now, looking at trying to depend on things that only last for 25 years, solar panels, that have to use these rather out of just as bad as far as fossil fuel, the resources for minerals? And how can we get around this? Somebody is shaking his head no, I see, but I want to know that answer. Yeah.
There's no way to get around it. There's no magic energy source in the world that doesn't come with some problems. I mean, and that's just, that's just the fact of life on a created planet, but the question is always going to be what's better and what's worse. And as I tried to explain, the actual mining burden on the planet would go down considerably in a world where we relied on renewable energy, because mostly what we mine in the world is coal, and we mine it in huge quantities and we burn it, and then you have to go mine more. So lithium and cobalt and things are very different. We can certainly figure out, and people have begun to do the work. Amnesty International has been a big player in this, in figuring out how to mine it in ways that are better. And so cobalt mining has slowly been improving, for instance, in the Congo, which has been one of the flashpoints for this. But it's, if I was going to tell you that there was a free lunch around here, I'd be lying. There's lunches that are more expensive and lunches that are cheaper. Given the stakes, we're well advised to go as hard and fast as we can towards the option that doesn't wreck the basic underlying ecosystem of the planet, and that doesn't kill 9 million people a year, 1 death in 5, from breathing the byproducts of fossil fuel combustion. My guess would be that at least some of your neighbors in the coast of California are perhaps not thinking entirely of people in foreign countries who have to mine lithium. They may be thinking about the view off the coast and whether or not they want to look at windmills and things. And truthfully, I think it's time for us to develop a new set of aesthetics to match the age in which we live. I've come to think of the view of windmills on the horizon as beautiful. It's the breeze made visible, and it's a visual acknowledgement of the fact that we're taking responsibility for the energy we use. Should we use less energy? Yes, and it's important to be working on efficiency and conservation as we do all of this. But it's not okay to make that a substitute for making this transition. We're going to need, let's just be frank about it. It's very clear from our society that we're going to use a lot of energy for a long time to come. As an organizer, I do not see a way to figure out how to organize quickly on a vast basis to get people to cut their energy demand, the stuff they use, whatever, in half. I think that kind of long cultural transition takes a long time. This technological transition doesn't need to take as long, and we can use it in part to rebalance power on this planet. One of the things that's good about sun and wind is that, as I said before, it's available everywhere. So moving in that direction to at least some degree, small d democratizes the energy field in a new and important way.
Thank you. Bill, I'm going to ask Mark to go ahead and unmute yourself. Bill, this is my friend Mark. His father was Richard Dietz, our colleague at the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a friend of Dr. King's and one of the heroes of nonviolence. Mark is going to ask you about grief, which I think is something we're all dealing with. And so see if you can light a fire under Mark, because he's a lifelong activist, but re-energize Mark. Okay, Mark, go ahead. Meet
Hey,
Bill.
I can't thank you enough for the work you've done. And it's my passion, doing something about climate change. You know, I do everything I can, solar panels. I'm getting an electric car next. I got a plug-in hybrid. I'm got plant-based bags only. I got recycled paper. And all this makes me feel good. But I also have a tremendous amount of grief because this beautiful planet is getting destroyed by the human race. And I just want to know how you deal with that, because it's hard. Every day I feel this passion and this happiness about doing something about it. And then I also feel this tremendous grief about, you know, seeing Mother Earth running a fever, and she's ill, and you can feel it if you really try.
Yes, someone once said that one of the inevitable results of living fully in the world is to, since it's a world of wounds, is that you feel that pain. And this is very true. You know, I love the outdoor world. I love the natural world. And it pains me deeply to watch it change in sad ways. Because of where I live, I love winter above all. And
Me too.
It breaks my heart to see winter disappearing. That season when, you know, we get when friction gives up its hold on the earth for a little while and we get to slide across the surface, the most magic possible thing. And breaks my heart. But of course, there's still a very beautiful world out there. And one of our jobs is to bear witness to it. We're the creature that can. So I spend time outdoors every day. And of course, we find great solace in action, and in as effective as action as possible. And I think particularly that means when we can work with others. Americans have a kind of natural default towards thinking about individual solutions. I do. One's own roof, mine's covered with solar panels, one's own garage, mine has an EV in it, whatever. But I keep reminding myself that we're well past the point where you can make the carbon math work 1 Tesla at a time. The mantra I keep repeating to myself is, the most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to make economic and political change. So that's why I keep spending most of my effort on organizing of this kind. And I think it's a real pleasure for others to get to work together on these things, and it lessens some of that grief. Let me just finish that though by saying that the place where this really makes me very, very sad is the grief and anxiety that young people are feeling around climate. I get letters, emails regularly, more than once a week, from young people wondering if it's okay for them to have kids or not on this world, because of the trauma that it's going through. Nobody should have to think like that, That's not fair or good or healthy in any way. And so really reach out to the young people around you. And from my experience, the most effective way to make them feel more optimistic about the world is to demonstrate that you and a lot of others are working hard in the right direction. Because otherwise they feel abandoned and left to their own devices to try and make this all work. And they're smart enough to know that that's just impossible.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you so much, Bill. And I'm going to ask a question now, then I'll call on David Hart. So it's sort of 2 questions, Bill, and you can ignore it, both of them if you want. One is about Greta. Remember when, was it Trump said, she must be a very angry young person, and people said she must be so sad and mean and angry and depressed. And she issued a statement, which is so helpful. No, I'm not any of those things because I have meaning in my life. And that's what Viktor Frankl taught. And since this is the Beatitude Center, I think that's the 4th Beatitude. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, climate justice. You will be satisfied, even if you don't get if we don't get the victories, a satisfaction of the deep meaning. If you want to reflect on that, and then I want to ask you about the 3rd Beatitude, because I never heard you say anything about it. I know you. Thank you for the blurb for my book. So I want to ask you about that, because that's why I wrote this book, and it still amazes me. The 3rd Beatitude is Jesus saying, "Blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth." Thomas Merton defines the word meek as Kingian, Gandhian, active, daring nonviolence. It's not at all what we've been thought. And then Merton says, okay, the more you're nonviolent, the more you're one with creation. And I thought, well, first of all, it's so weird that Jesus said that. Well, then why was I never taught that? Oh, because we haven't been taught nonviolence, and we're not one with creation. And so we're having climate change. So any thoughts on those 3rd and 4th Beatitudes? For fun, Bill, for fun.
Absolutely.
You're a holy Methodist, so preach.
We Methodists are quite methodical. We're the exact opposite of all the interesting cults in the world. The most methodical and let me talk about Greta for a minute first, because she's amazing.
Yeah.
She's spoken quite openly about the fact that she's autistic, and in fact described autism in a way as her superpower, allowing her to focus and not to care that much what people are thinking of her. Not an easy thing for high school girls, to be willing to take on, not any easy for anybody to take on the level of abuse she's had to, but you know, I think back when I was in high school, I would not have been up to that. One of the things that I really love about her, I remember greeting her in New York. You know that she doesn't fly, so when she came to the UN to give her talk, they took her on a sailboat across the Atlantic. And it was a pretty rough crossing on a racing sailboat because she had to get there fast, you know. But I remember talking with her when I got there, and I've always wanted to do that. And I said, what was it like? And she just started going on and on about how when she'd get up to pee at night, you know, just to see the stars above and in their, you know, just huge glory. And it made me extraordinarily grateful that she was able to get that kind of reward for the work that she was doing. As for the meek inheriting the earth, I think that's absolutely right. Look, nonviolence is a very strange thing. It's like alchemy. It should not work, you know. I mean, why should getting arrested or what? I mean, it basically should demonstrate your powerlessness, right, instead of your power. And clearly, though, as I say, I think it really was a technological invention of the 20th century. It harkens in profound ways back to the cross. And so that allows us to understand its power a little bit. I mean, it's very strange to be part of a religion, this, you know, a Christian enterprise that, if you think about it, it's kind of defined by weakness. I mean, you start out with a little baby, and the baby then grows up and gets killed. You know, that's, you know, that's a weird, different story than you expect for stories about power and whatever. And the degree to which the church has wandered away from that story in 2,000 years is, of course, enormous. But it's a great pleasure always to, you know, try and recapture some of that story. And a powerful, powerful way to connect with it is to get to engage in that same kind of work in one's lifetime. I have a lot of people who tell me, a surprising number of people who tell me, I mean, look, going to jail is not the key part of movement building. Most of the work is being on Facebook and writing petitions and lobbying people and making phone calls and raising money and all the other zillion things that it takes. But I do have a surprising number of people who tell me that going to jail is on their bucket list. And I always say, well, I'm probably able to help you with it if you really want, you know. And I think it represents some impulse in people to do something sacrificial, because that helps, well, because that fits with who we are.
Well, thank you, Bill. As you know, I'm a big fan of going to jail. Been arrested 85 times. And let's get Jane to start Fire Drill Fridays again, especially in the fall of 2024. You and I and Jane and Mark Dietz will get arrested every Friday next fall. I'll put it on my calendar. You call me. I'm serious. Now, since I got you for a second, and I'm going to ask David to speak, but since you brought these things up, do you think Greta would ever do a Zoom for me? And you don't have to answer it, but could you maybe email her and introduce me to her? And I'll leave it up to you. And you can just leave it.
I'll get you in touch with her people if you want. She's you know, she has more demands on her than just about anyone on the planet.
It's amazing.
I always hesitate to add to them in any way because
so forget
above all, I want her to be able to have something approaching normal girlhood, you know.
Okay, then let me put some demands on you.
Yes.
You're so eloquent about nonviolence, and you're widely read around the world. And I'm coming out with my 40th book, and nobody reads on nonviolence. Would you consider, and you don't have to answer this, feel free to say no, but you can just move on to David's question, writing a book on nonviolence? Because what you have just said is so brilliant. and original your ideas, the story of weakness and powerless and it shouldn't work. You have a lot of insights. So you don't have to answer that if you don't
Someday,
want.
sure.
Okay. Bill, this week I just got my copy of the new 1,000-page biography of Martin Luther King, King a Life. It's incredible.
That's the book.
And I hope you'll read it. Jonathan, the author, is going to do a Zoom with us in January, and maybe
Nice.
you'd like to be on it. I'm going to
I'll
pass
look
it to
forward to listening
David
to that.
Hartso, one of the great teachers of nonviolence who knew Dr. King and all. David, jump in with a question, and then we better wrap it up because our hour and a half is over.
Thanks so much, Bill. Very helpful and inspirational to me and all of us and to the world. The world needs you. And my question, it seems to me we have two existential crises that could really put an end to human life on our planet. One is the climate crisis, and the other is nuclear war. And my question is, and as you know, the US military is the largest polluter and user of fossil fuels in the world. How these two movements could work more together. And as you said, the more people we have, the more power we have. And
Yes.
rather than working separately, how can we work together?
It's a good question. We're doing my friend, wonderful indigenous leader Penny Opal Plant in the Bay Area has convened a webinar for, I think, Monday, where we're talking about figuring out how to do some of the divestment work around that we've done around fossil fuels, around nuclear weapons too. And I think it's really important. My great mentor and dearest friend when I was a young writer at the New Yorker was Jonathan Schell, and the greatest of the writers about the nuclear threat that there's ever been. And so I take it with extraordinary seriousness and think that we have got to figure out how to do that. The only thing I would say is that the only difference between them is that we're absolutely in the middle of the climate, the explosion of carbon in the atmosphere. So far, since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, knock on wood, and today is one of those dangerous days with what's going on in Russia that reminds one of how tenuous this all is. We've managed not to, explode any more nuclear weapons. We are exploding, as I said, the equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs, heat equivalent, every single day now in our atmosphere, and that's what's and that's why I think of all the things we've ever faced, this to me is the single most immediate, and that's why. But I agree with you. It'll be great to have as much work as possible across a wide variety of these questions. I would also just add that, and I've said this through, but just to make clear as we end, the other thing that climate change really allows one to focus on is structural inequality on our planet in the most profound ways. The iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. Africa has produced 2% of all the carbon emissions on the planet, but it's the continent that's being hit hardest every day. So this is a real way to think about globalism and to think about power and how it all relates. So all these things are incredibly important, and I think the more we work on any of them, the stronger we get on all of them. So many thanks to everybody on this call for the tremendous work you've done throughout your lives. What a privilege it is to get to be with you and just in your communion for 90 minutes, and I'll look forward to getting to listen in on some of these calls going forward. So
Bill, let's
you.
have a big round of applause with show of hands to thank our leader and teacher, Bill McKibben, and our friend. Bill, I'm so grateful. I'm going to write you, and please consider doing this again next year for us. That would be really wonderful. And thank you for mentioning Jonathan Shaw, my friend and teacher too. Can I just give a little commercial break, Bill, with your blessing? We have a bunch of other wonderful upcoming Zooms on July. On July 15th, my friend Father Joe Brown, who's a Jesuit priest, will be talking about Christianity and racism and justice and working for equality. He's one of the few, maybe the only African-American Jesuit in the country right now. Then Medea Benjamin, one of the leading voices of peace and activists in the country, will be talking about the Ukraine on July 29th. On August 12, live from Bethlehem, we'll have my friend Zugbi, one of the leading voices of nonviolence among the Palestinians, and now the global head of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, which Gandhi was a part of. He's great. And then Cornel West on September 9th. Bill, if you want to join us, you're welcome to. I can send you the links. Then Adam Bucko, Catherine Meeks, Matthew Fox, and finally at Christmas, Jonathan Montaldo on Merton, and David Stendelross on Gratitude, live at 97 years old from the monastery in Salzburg, Austria. And then Jonathan in January on Dr. King. So a lot going up. Bill, thanks for being with us and supporting the Beatitude Center. Thank you very much, everybody, for supporting us. And the best thing we can do to thank Bill, dear friends, is to hear his call to action and not give up, but to do hopeful things and get involved in the third act and support Bill's holy, holy work. And on that note, let's all give a deep bow of gratitude to God as well for this call to work to protect creation. We thank you and bless you, God. And dear friends, I'm going to stop the recording. I know Bill's got to go, but anybody who wants to stay on for a few minutes and talk is very welcome. So again, God bless everybody who's live and who will watch this in future years to come.
Amen.
Thanks, Bill. I'll sign off now here on the recording.